open source demos, industry conversations, and the latest updates from around the global open infrastructure community. And we are broadcasting this every Thursday at 1500 UTC on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you like to log into your streams. We're going to try to get there and bring you all back together on this show. This has been an awesome way for us to connect with the community while we haven't been able to travel and get together in person. And we're excited that we're continuing it on. We started it last year. And, we, because it's live, have an opportunity for anybody out there who's joining the stream to ask questions. So go ahead and jump in the chat, start telling us where you're joining from. It's always incredible to me how many different countries we hit people participating from, why you're excited about this topic, or any questions you have. And we can get to those questions throughout the show. So at any time, feel free to start telling us kind of what's on your mind or what you think about this topic. So with that, let's talk about the topic. So today's episode is LOKI. Now, this is something you may have heard of. We talked about it a little bit a few months ago. We introduced this concept. But before we kind of get back into refreshing everyone's memory about what this actually is as a concept, I thought it would be fun to talk about the origin story. Now, like all good origin stories, it starts with scientists in a lab, okay? Now, in this case, they were data scientists, so maybe different than what you would expect in most of these origin stories. But it really all started with the data, and I love data. And when we looked at the patterns in the market, we talked to users, we did surveys, we just really analyzed what are people doing with infrastructure. We're the Open Infrastructure Summit. We want to know what people are doing with it. And one of the things we found, looking at, for example, the OpenStack user survey, is that 97% of all OpenStack users are running it on Linux or with Linux. And we'll talk a bit more about kind of the concept of the stack and whether it really applies here, but we think of this as kind of a stack. And so not a big surprise here. We know Linux has been fundamental to the creation and success of OpenStack, so nobody should be too surprised by this stat. But the other stat we found in looking at the user survey is consistently year after year is 70% of users who are running OpenStack are running it in combination with Kubernetes. And so when we looked at this set of projects and we said people are running them together, these pieces of software, they're incredibly critical to the modern cloud infrastructure, whether you're talking, data center, edge, people are combining these all over the place. And so really what we thought of is what happens when you put these together. You get LOKI, meaning Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes infrastructure. And to be clear, this is not an open source project. These are obviously individual, very, very active open source projects. We'll talk about this, a little bit of the stats on that in a minute. So really, this is an acronym or a stack similar to the LAMP stack. It is not its own open source project. I think that's sometimes a few people have had questions about that. I know there are open source projects called LOKI. Grafana has one. There's another one that's been out for several years. So this is not to create confusion around these other projects. There are many projects out there actually that they call themselves LOKI. This is an acronym or a stack or a concept to describe a pattern that we're seeing in the market. And what we want to talk about today is kind of what are people actually doing with these? How are they doing it? What are the use cases? Why is this such a common pattern? And LOKI just gives us kind of a fun way to think about it and talk about it. And in terms of these three projects, one of the things that is amazing to me, if you look across all of open source, what you find is that these three projects are three of the four most active open source projects in the world in any category. And so if you look at the contribution statistics in terms of the amount of code that's coming in every single year to these projects, in terms of changes being merged, you see that about 80,000 changes are merged from the Linux community, which is just incredible, far and away, the most active out there. And then, of course, OpenStack and Kubernetes are neck and neck in terms of like changes coming in. So what's amazing to me is that this actually shows you that the infrastructure layers, the cloud computing sort of building blocks are some of the most active in terms of contributions, innovation, investment, developer time, all the companies around the ecosystem that are putting these together. So when you add that up, it's 150,000 changes throughout the year. So when we think about these coming together, again, they are different communities, they are different pieces of software, but there's a lot of cross community work. There are a lot of people that actually work across in multiple of these communities, and we think that putting these together, of course, will not be simple, and people are already doing it, but we want to hear more about how they're doing it, what they're struggling with, where they can have more success, and kind of why this pattern is become really the OpenInfra standard. And you see Linux, of course, is the standard and kind of operating system layer. And you have OpenStack as a standard and kind of open source infrastructure as a service layer. And then, of course, Kubernetes, everyone knows, is the standard when it comes to the industry's adoption of container orchestration, et cetera. So when you put these together, we see this as a really compelling pattern. So let's actually bring on our guests to talk more about this and see what's actually behind this pattern. So joining us today, we have Maria, who's joining us from Red Hat. And we also have Phil, who's joining us from Canonical. So when we talk about Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes, it's hard to think of two better sources than folks like yourselves. So Maria, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself to our OpenInfra Live audience?
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Bradshaw. I am the manager of the product management team at Red Hat, covering OpenStack as well as some areas of OpenShift as well. And I'm really happy to be here to talk to you and the community about LOKI.
Hey, Phil.
Hi, everyone. My name's Phil Williams. I am a product manager at Canonical. My day-to-day is actually more around storage and Ceph and the products in that world. But I've a long time been involved with OpenStack, and I kind of think of it as like a secondary area that I still like to keep tabs on, and everything in infrastructure is always interesting.
Good. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Ceph. There's obviously just such an incredible world of open source out there, and people are putting these building blocks together. In terms of this kind of Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes, are you seeing your customers kind of adopting these together? Let's maybe start with you, Phil. Kind of how do you see are your customers actually combining these things?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's funny. We've developed this like new name, right? But it's actually something that's been happening for a while. Think back to the Magnum project. That was the first sort of attempt of containers within OpenStack. It's kind of this layered infrastructure that the acronym kind of spells out. But yeah, we see customers who, they have today's applications that are very much tied to like a VM type infrastructure. But then they have new developers who are developing the next gen of their business applications, and they're focusing more on containers and how they can have some of those containers in private clouds on-prem, some containers in public cloud. How do they manage this new hybrid world together? So yeah, we see both. They're both super popular.
Okay, Maria, what's your perspective on this? Are you seeing this with your customers?
Yeah, so when you look at this LOKI acronym, look at the first RHEL came out 28 years ago. Then OpenStack in 2013, Red Hat OpenStack, and then OpenShift really in 2011, but it really went all into Kubernetes in 2014, and we never looked back. So we've been doing this for a while. We've been doing this sort of internally. Obviously, we ship out our distributions with, we put them together. But we've also seen different building blocks of how this has been resonating with customers, how new use cases are being deployed, and also the workloads that are driving the different ways on which this, are built together to form the infrastructure to support them, because it's all about the workloads for us.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I have to say that Maria introduced me to the concept of a backronym, which I didn't even realize we had created one when we came up with this LOKI concept. But apparently, that's the more accurate description than acronym. So always learning new terms. So I guess what I'd like to ask next is why people are combining these. Kind of what's the motivation or the main reasons that you see people putting these together. Maria, do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this in how sort of natural evolution and Red Hat. That's we work in. We're born in open source. We work and collaborate in communities. So I would say the first thing is that once you're in the community, you start seeing sort of some of these use cases and where things are sort of going. So how they start putting it together, I would say it's born at the community level first. Some companies dabble in open source. Red Hat is completely open. Obviously, there's alternatives that are not open to I guess, the LOKI infrastructure. But because we live in this completely open world, it's very common that we ended up where we are. So, for us as a development model, but also as the values and principles of how we work and how we continue to collaborate with communities. So Linux as the base for, or Red Hat Enterprise Linux as the base and the ground for running applications, but then also a base for building the infrastructure to run it in the case of OpenStack, and with OpenShift being Red Hat Linux Core OS. It was very clear that depending on the use cases and the workloads, they would be aligned in different ways. And you, at the beginning of this call or program, you were showing sort of attachment rates, meaning some Kubernetes users, there are also OpenStack users and also Linux users, but obviously those are numbers that we also see in our customers and how it is being used, and not necessarily in the order that the acronym calls it out, so Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes, but also, sometimes in some cases, some Kubernetes under the OpenStack piece, and then, depending if you're going to the edge, you can do that with, a piece of OpenStack distributed, or a piece of only Linux, or a piece of Kubernetes. It just having that freedom to see what best suits each particular use case is great.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that, I think we like to think of it as a stack, and the idea is kind of analogous to the lamp stack, and it's like building blocks you put together, and it helps kind of people do more, and it sort of comes as a pattern. But obviously, when we actually call it a stack, in a distributed system, the idea of a vertical stack is pretty much like fiction. So it's like a useful fiction, but it's not at all like always in one pattern. And many people run OpenStack on Kubernetes. We actually demoed that at, I think, the Austin Summit like 6 years ago or something. So I'm really glad you point that out, which is like, this is not a literal sort of like it's more like architecture than architecture, but it's about combining these technologies, and certainly it's Linux all the way down in terms of every layer. There's going to be Linux in the VMs and in the host OS, and so yeah, it's a nice acronym or backronym, but I think it's important when we get into the details to talk about the exact ways people combine them. It's definitely not just like a really neat stack, because it's like a complex distributed system, and edge will be different than data center and everything. So all good points. So Phil, I guess the same question for you, kind of what do you see as the drivers or reasons people would want to or are already combining these projects in production?
I just want to echo one point you made about 30 seconds ago. It's like this one size doesn't fit all. In certain locations, you have certain limitations, so you don't necessarily want lots of infrastructure or lots of infrastructure overhead. So in those kind of places, it might make sense to lay down bare metal, run Kubernetes natively, directly on that bare metal, don't have any virtualization layer in between. You might have a larger premise where you already have OpenStack, you already have, a chunk of infrastructure, you have spare capacity, run Kubernetes on top of that. It makes logical sense. You then might want to expand out into public cloud, run Kubernetes in say AWS, but not use AKS. I was going to say EKS, one of the products of Amazon. So you may want to again use the VM model there, but keep the same tooling so that you have a multitude of locations, but all managed in the same way. So yeah, it's definitely Definitely not one size fits all. And it's very evolutionary. You have applications today, they're built in a certain way. You have stuff that's being built for the future. Again, different paradigms get used. So yeah, evolution. It happens again and again.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I said at the beginning, tell us where you're joining from. We've got people from all over the world, and also drop questions in chat. And, I think we actually already got a question. I think this might be directed at Maria, which is Ram said from Hong Kong. And I lost it. There it is. It'd be really great if Red Hat provides Kubernetes stacks for developers, which can be installed in commands, etc. So maybe, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Ram. Thanks for the question. I can point you out to the try.openshift.com, which you can see the many ways that you can try running OpenShift, which includes our distribution of Kubernetes, fully compliant, as well as other components to help better operationalize it or use it. The other thing I would point out, and I would be remiss if I don't call it out, at Red Hat, again, we're all open source, and in the OpenStack community, or the open infrastructure community, we also support the distribution of RDO, which is our sort of midstream distribution of OpenStack, which is also free for developers. And we have a similar path in the Kubernetes world, which is called OKD. So again, free for developers, you can use it. So you're welcome to try. Thanks.
Yeah, and for everybody else on the stream, keep jumping questions in, and we'll throw them out as we go if we have time. But I think we'll have some more time here. So in terms of these combinations, I think there are always customer requirements, and I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that in terms of what types of requirements would lead to a customer or user out there to want to seek out these particular tools. I think Maria looks like she's ready to answer, so I'll throw it to you.
Well, let's answer the like obvious use case that really took or transformed or disrupted the world of telecommunications with this community, really, which is the adoption of OpenStack in the whole telecom stack. It's huge. Is a dominant technology for 4G. It's deployed anywhere and everywhere in the world for running VNFs or virtualized network functions. So that, again, is all about the workload. So that's the particular workload that really benefited from the robust and stable OpenStack stack, as well as the networking that it provides. So I would say that would be like the first thing to go. And then in the same community, the workloads, again, so the move to 5G and workloads that are more closer to the edge and that are now containerized, kind of drove the adoption of more of a container manager system, which is Kubernetes. And then that drove the need to say, well, existing telcos have their deployments in 4G. Now they have this new need of new technology of 5G. How can they play along? How can I bring my new with my existing, as well as continue to grow? Because we've seen in our customers that they're existing, we have, many huge customers all over the world that 100% depend on Red Hat OpenStack to run, production workloads. And their deployments are, in some cases, at the early ages of the early stages of deployment. They're only going to continue to grow. Mark and the community have seen just how much the scale of OpenStack has been such a great topic for us. So that's one thing. So as 4G continues to grow, 5G calls out for Kubernetes. How do these two come together? That's one way of how the LOKI stack is sort of represented in the telco vertical.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we always come back to infrastructure is basically compute, storage, and networking. How do you automate all this? And obviously that's just a massive problem space. And specifically these use cases around networking, it's incredible how much OpenStack is really the adopted standard there. Like you were saying, that every mobile phone call, every mobile connection in the United States goes through an OpenStack powered network today, like every single one. And we have 9 out of 10 of the largest telecoms in the world. So billions of subscribers every day, pick up their phones, and they probably don't call people. Nobody calls anymore, but WhatsApp, text, whatever, Telegram, and it goes over a data connection that in somewhere in that architecture is powered by OpenStack. So, and as people, like you said, want to adopt, container technologies for all the obvious reasons, then that drives people to adopt them together. So really good example of the market sort of demanding that we make these things work. So Phil, what are your thoughts on this? What do you see as kind of either verticals or requirements that are kind of driving people to say, make these work together?
So telco again is such a big use case the world over, but then we see other like pockets of interest. So think to more like regional CSPs. So those countries where you don't get an AWS, you don't get an Azure, you have local ISPs, local cloud providers who are using this stack to offer this infrastructure as a service, container as a service type offerings, within their regions. These regions are not particularly big, from an Amazon or a large-scale cloud provider perspective, but for these, local companies, they're scaling up super quickly. And I think the other side of it is really the educational, the R&D that happens within universities. These are the people who are really pushing the boundaries of what the current tech can do. They're going to be the people making the next gen tech, and having this mixed stack, as we keep talking about, gives them so much flexibility when they're doing their research projects for their PhDs and coming up with the new stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there is so much interesting use cases for open source and infrastructure technologies together for all kinds of research out there. We probably have used the CERN example to excess, but it is obviously fundamental physics research. But as you said, genetic research, biological research, all kinds of really interesting cutting edge research is happening on using these tools. And it's pretty cool to think of kind of all this open source as being essentially like part of the scientific instrument that ultimately is leading to different breakthroughs. So I always get excited about those use cases. So in terms of maybe getting into more detail or more examples of users, or in your case, they would be customers. I wonder if you all have any customer names you can mention. Maria, do you want to drop any names here just to give people more of a flavor of who's actually running this stuff in production?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about telco. I would, telco also has an aspect of sort of internal cloud or a private cloud that they use for their enterprise. So also within telco, I have several cases of company is a telco, but their use case is a private cloud for enterprise running workloads. So I think OpenStack is perfect for that. Through whatever reason, security, governance, compliance, they need to keep their sources local. So they run OpenStack to do that. In terms of customer examples, so you mentioned every call in the US go through OpenStack. I would say touches Red Hat OpenStack. So I won't touch US customers, but Vodafone Idea, one of India's leading telecom provider, they use Red Hat OpenStack platform. They use Red Hat Self Storage, Red Hat Ansible automation, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux today to transform the distributed networks of data center into open standards. So this is really the one of the key drivers is when customers kind of go into the open standards just to see basically open interfaces based on this universal cloud. And then they also extend and serve third-party workloads for others. And then another customer, just to go over to Europe, Proximus. The Proximus Group is Belgium's largest telco provider, and they are replacing a very costly bare metal server environment with just more flexible, more scalable network functional virtualization or VNFs. And then they approach that by standardizing on Red Hat OpenStack platform. They use Red Hat OpenShift and Red Hat Self Storage Red Hat OpenShift being the Kubernetes portion of it. And they use also running VNFs, and they use Red Hat OpenStack platform. And Proximus can scale the voice and data applications as needed. And they're doing it at 20% lower the cost compared to the just bare metal deployment. They now have the ability to scale flexibly according to demand. And if they experience peak activity in one particular domain, then they can allocate those compute resources for a particular amount of time until the demand decreases and then scale down. They can use that as commodity servers, and just much more effective than just trying to customize your own telco background. Nobody does that. Why would you do that? Nobody has time for that.
Good. Those are awesome examples, and I'm sure most people are probably familiar, but obviously Red Hat OpenStack is your OpenStack product. Red Hat OpenShift is the way people would get Kubernetes from kind of the Red Hat product portfolio. I'm not going to try to do it justice and explain it, but just to kind of give people that pointer in case they heard all the terms of how they fit together. But obviously, correct me if I'm wrong. But in terms of, Canonical and Phil, maybe you can kind of give you the same question here, which is, who are some of the customers that you know of that are running LOKI stack today?
Yeah, so sticking with the theme of telco, a company from my home country, British Telecom, they are using what you would class as a LOKI stack, so OpenStack, again for NFV type workloads, more stateful workloads. But then also have a level of containerization stuff going on there. They also use Ceph. All of our products are delivered as charms. So we use Juju as our model-driven operations tooling. So you create a model, and that then allows very rapid deployment of the various services. Thinking about education, so a recent customer of ours is the King Abdullah Science and Technology University in the Middle East. Again, same sort of mixed stack. And then there is an ISP in Pakistan called Nayatel. So they are the sort of example I was using around a CSP. So again, they use the full stack to deliver the infrastructure as a service, as well as a container as a service type product to their end users.
What I love about these examples is just how incredibly global these communities are. The Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes communities are just incredibly global, and I think it just goes to show you the value of building these things in the open. Is it allows people, anyone in the world, to contribute, anyone in the world to kind of take these technologies to market and benefit from them. And if you look at just like the Open Infrastructure Foundation, our communities, we have over 120,000 people in 180 plus countries. So just always reminded of how the power of working together across countries and across communities is that so many different use cases can bloom, but also just all around the world in all these different countries. So in terms of, the community side, maybe this is a good time to talk about that a little bit. So, I mentioned before that these technologies are all developed by these upstream communities that are incredibly vibrant. The three of the top four open source projects in the world happen to be used for infrastructure, which is a great sign. By the way, the fourth, for anyone who's curious, is Chromium, which is like the Chrome OS, Chrome browser. So people probably use that in infrastructure a little bit, but these other three obviously are big. So thinking about these communities, how do we encourage more, I guess, collaboration? What is the key here in terms of what we need to be doing to kind of make sure that when we get all the way down to these companies running it in production, that they have a good experience, right? Because obviously it doesn't just happen by magic. So does anyone have any thoughts on kind of how we can make sure at the very upstream community level that we're doing the right things to build bridges and build technologies that work well together?
Sure, I'll dive in. So it's quite interesting, this open world. So my original tech background was very proprietary. I worked for a large storage company. Everything was very developed in-house. There was no chance of ever seeing any source code. And then I made this career change a few years ago and got into the open source world. And just this idea of being able to understand to the minute detail of what is actually going on, what you're putting into production. And then when it doesn't work, being able to fix it and then being able to share that back with the people who actually created it is super powerful. And I think that like mindset change is something that we really have to publicize to more traditional, businesses who go and buy a thing. They have a service agreement for it. They don't ever think about how they're going to fix it. They just open a ticket and a patch will come in 3 months' time. This idea where you can contribute to this open world is super powerful.
Love that answer. Maria, I know you're very passionate about this and you work with lots and lots of engineers who contribute to all these different communities. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding trite, right? Like developers. It's all about the technologies that we use at the end of the day are created by people, and just making sure that we can continue to work together and collaborate for the benefit of, humanity, without even trying to sound, corny, but that's what we're doing. We're just with this technologies, we're changing the world and hopefully improving it. So we need to be able to make sure that we can work together. Going back to kind of what Phil was saying with his background, like I just remembered my first as a customer. I was working at that time at Tata Communications, and maybe I'm going to be booted out of this call because it was years and years ago. OpenStack wasn't even near a thing, and we needed to launch the first public cloud in India, and we standardized on CloudStack. Sorry, they didn't know any better at that point. However, that's when I got my first taste of, we didn't get a good feedback from the vendor at that time, and we just thought, well, this is open source. Can we go to straight the community? And we just started getting the collaboration that we needed from third-party vendors, from storage partners, from networking partners. And we just started to see that more in the open. And it was such a relief. I remember as a customer, they have to deliver a service for your end users and to continue to, just provide a service for the company. That was just so comforting to be able to see that everybody was kind of working together through the power of open source. So very similar right now with what we see with customers when they get super excited about, not just because we're talking about the LOKI stack, right? So they would get Linux, and they would get in the form of RHEL. They would get OpenStack in the form of Red Hat OpenStack, and Kubernetes in the form of OpenShift from Red Hat. But it's just so much more, right? There's networking partners and storage partners and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only way to work together and to continue to build on those and not just create snowflakes that will never see the light of day, but just really, truly great architectures and use cases, and then be able to replicate that with others with minimum amount of work or less amount of work if you were trying to build it from scratch yourself. That is super powerful. So we need to continue to make sure that we continue to encourage that. I have seen it, it can happen in both ways. I guess it can happen from the communities itself coming together. I have seen it forcefully enforced by customers. Basically, you need to make this work. You need to make this stack work for me, as well as an all integration, or I need a particular feature to work across all of these. And we see several that touch all the way from Linux to OpenStack to OpenShift and to Kubernetes. So it can happen from many, all those forces, and it can happen from developers just knowing, what needs to be done.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you get kind of the best actions we can take kind of on the foundation community, management side is bringing people together upstream and trying to figure out how to make the technologies work together. And in terms of the snowflake issue, absolutely. I think you see that within individual projects. And if you're going to put them all together, which is required today, plus, as you said, much, much more, it's not just these 3 projects, right? That the snowflake problem is actually the biggest problem. And one of the reasons we wanted to kind of coin this backronym, if you will, was just kind of highlight more of how dependent these technologies are on each other and how dependent really the customers are. And I love your point about like a lot of times the sort of demand to work together, get these things working together comes from the customers, and they're just demanding customers are a good thing ultimately, right? That they know what they need to serve their end customers. And I think just to make sure we're keeping up with some of the questions in chat, I was going to mention one here that came up a couple minutes ago, which is what is the main difference between a LOKI stack and using OpenShift from Red Hat? So we might be able to pop that up on screen from Steve, and that would seem to be for you, Maria.
Yeah, so the LOKI stack refers to just pure open source projects created by the community, backed by hundreds of community members, as well as companies like Red Hat, for example. But ultimately, they're all available in the open. When you purchase or when you get OpenShift from Red Hat, OpenShift is Kubernetes, so the K piece of it, running on Red Hat Core OS as well, which is Linux based. And so the difference is you're getting a distribution from Red Hat. So we contribute upstream. Red Hat always first upstream, and then we do either additional testing, packaging. OpenShift in particular is also a ton of other projects that are part of the CNCF, which is this other foundation, and sort of built together and ready to use for you in an enterprise type of way. If you can also kind of do it yourself. And I want to address a phenomenon that I see here. There's a lot of phenomena that we see in the kind of Kubernetes community or CNCF or Kubernetes adoption model that we have already seen if you've been in OpenStack for a long time, especially as we've been with OpenStack for a long time. I'm like, oh, I remember when we used to do that. Then they stopped. So part of it is there at the beginning of OpenStack, there were a lot of like do-it-yourself, like even large enterprises that had a ton of developers. They would go and sort of curate their own distribution from upstream. And instead of getting, Red Hat OpenStack or from, Canonical, they would sort of use their own parts. I don't know if I can say Lego, but, calling out, like putting them together and curating them themselves. The problem with that is then you end up maintaining that infrastructure and all of the, basically maintaining the technology instead of building on, whatever it is that you're building or the applications or the services that you're using for your, company or your business. So really the difference between the LOKI stack and OpenShift is that with OpenShift, you're getting the curated version of Kubernetes by Red Hat. And instead of just creating your own when you get it from the community. Obviously, there's examples of companies that are perfectly capable to do this because they also contribute and they are active participants of the community. I think the biggest mistakes is when I see companies that try to sort of do it yourself, but they do not contribute to the upstream communities. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think, we have seen definitely over the years in the OpenStack example of sometimes there's a temptation, and I'm sure this applies to all forms of open source really in this stack and others, but there's a real temptation to kind of like make a few changes because it's so easy to make changes and sort of customize it to your environment. And then what you end up finding is that it becomes much harder to upgrade, just as an example of where people get stuck on old versions and then they didn't necessarily contribute those changes upstream. So then the next version of OpenStack or any of these, popular projects comes out, it doesn't have your feature in it because you didn't contribute it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, how do I upgrade? And then you find yourself like on a 3-year-old version and all the things that you were frustrated weren't in the project when you first adopted it. They're all in there now, but you don't have access to them. And there are a lot of ways to kind of try to avoid that fate, but I think it is very wise to try to avoid it, in my opinion, because we have seen just a lot of people, kind of give into that temptation to like customize it to your heart's content, and then you're happy for a little while, but you kind of a lot of the benefits of being aligned with these upstream communities that, again, 3 of the 4 most active projects, right? We have 100,000 plus changes a year. You want access to that, not just the moment you install it, but the next year, like that's the bet on open infrastructure. and you don't want to sort of find yourself one day missing out on, it's like FOMO of the future. I don't know. I'll have to work on that one. So that question was really, for Red Hat, but I would give you a chance, Phil, if any of these just concepts come to mind, anything you want to add, and then we can maybe look at some more questions in the chat.
Yeah, so conceptually, Canonical delivers a curated OpenStack and a curated Kubernetes. Red Hat and ourselves, we do very, very similar things with these open source projects. We both contribute back as much as our various organizations can and that kind of thing. But the one thing that I thought was really important that you mentioned, Matt, was really around the upgrades. Like, if you look at the maturity of an OpenStack upgrade now compared to like 3, maybe longer, 4 or 5 years ago, you had some people who'd gone off and built their own clouds and, like you said, fell behind. So things then became like a migration to catch up. They build a new cloud with the new code, with the features that they actually wanted that they kind of shoehorned into their previous environments. And they're doing full-scale migrations and like back-end storage migrations just to catch up. Whereas if they contributed that stuff in the first place, they would have had a much smoother process. And honestly, the community would have been much better off.
Yeah, good point. And, I think that looking back through kind of our questions here, there was one question that I'm not completely sure if I understand it, but I'll put it on there anyway. We'll see if we can get an answer to it. But the question was, love to learn more about how ISPs are using OpenStack versus just enterprise. And I guess ISP could mean different things. I'm not sure if that's their meaning.
Internet service provider, I would say, and
Sure.
that fits on the case of that we're talking about telcos and how telcos just use it as just a cloud provider, basically. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing to add there is, traditionally where you have like a managed firewall from an ISP sat at the end of a leased line, now that's just a VM. It's something that exists in a virtualized environment. They don't have to worry about deploying a thing and having somebody unplug stuff in. It's so much more, it's easier to deploy and it's more dynamic. So that could be part of what the question was around.
Sure. And I kind of made a leap that may have been wrong, but what I thought of as public cloud providers, which are, sort of CSPs, I guess, to use a different acronym, but certainly there are lots of public cloud providers that are powered by OpenStack and, of course, Linux and Kubernetes together. And, we see that today the public cloud footprint of OpenStack powered clouds, which, I think pretty much all of them are also running Linux and Kubernetes, right? So you could think of it as LOKI stack public cloud footprint. It's actually in more data centers, that footprint, than even like an AWS. So the aggregate power of the community, the aggregate power of like this global ecosystem where there's cloud providers all around the world. And I have no doubt that they're all, running technologies from your companies as well to get to market. So that may or may not be what you meant by ISP, but that was good to just mention that note, because often when people say, is it just enterprise, there's a knowledge gap, or people are curious. Well, what about like the cloud providers? And it's often kind of people that the big three public cloud providers in the US sort of are sort of overshadow in the mind's eye what's happening in the market. But if you look all around the world, there are many cloud service providers running these technologies. So I'll just get that plug in there. I think, another question that came up was around kind of the future of these technologies. So when we think about how to make these infrastructure technologies work well together, do you think that a lot of the future work we need to do, or the things that are right in front of us, are more from the lower levels, like hardware support, trying to get more more support in the hardware layers, or more like up the stack? Like, do we need to be focusing more on what the upper layers are? Like, where is the kind of most important work kind of from an open infrastructure community foundation area?
Yeah, I guess I can take that a bit. So When we look at sort of Linux as being the more mature technology out of the stack that you're proposing, then OpenStack being the second more mature, and then Kubernetes being sort of the newer. Obviously, when there's more maturity, you have to do sort of less development just to guarantee basic functionality and just to make sure that it works. But we still see that through, again, workloads, we're getting a ton of requirements to improve on the sort of, we have pressure from customers to improve on networking features as well as hardware enablement. So bringing in new hardware, and the way that we do that is sort of newer versions of Linux that are supported with OpenStack, and then they get supported with OpenShift. So I want to point out, internally we call it Shift on Stack or OpenShift on OpenStack or Kubernetes on OpenStack. So we're doing a lot of work on this Shift on Stack. It's always Shift on Stack on Linux, but the Linux is kind of obvious with Red Hat. And we do a lot of work to make sure that the networking works across the board, that the storage workloads can also reach down all the way to the infrastructure and things like that. But there's one particular area that, as we build all of these together, needs to also come together. And that is, I guess, observability is one that I would call out. We have tooling for observability for workloads, and that's fantastic. We have tooling for observability for the OpenStack side, for the Kubernetes side, for the Linux side. Making sure that all of that kind of comes together in a way that that can be consumed by a human. Would be really beneficial. I think there's a lot of work that can happen in that to really bring it to life.
That's great insight. And I Phil, do you have a take on this? Obviously, there's going to be lots of work in every direction, but do you have a instinct on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the above side of things. So we obviously are thinking here very much infrastructure. But then when you start to think about how you deal with applications, so one of the things that we do with Juju and Charms is we also charm applications. So you have the same tooling to deal with hardware, the same tooling to deal with the OpenStack bits, the Kubernetes bits. But then what do you do for the application on top? Do you want to worry about how you scale an application and how that ties to containers and ties to underlying VMs or underlying hardware? You almost want to get rid of all of that complexity. So that's one thing that charmed applications bring us, is that you can, start to ignore the underlying and let the machine deal with all of the resource allocation. And you just ask for more units of an application. And if you deploy this application, if it needs something else that supports it, there's automated relations between the two. It'll deploy both applications. So yeah, how we start to abstract away from hardware is kind of interesting too. Or maybe not even hardware, but the infrastructure itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's in my conversations with operators and just people all over the world that are involved in kind of like open infrastructure and OpenStack, and looking at where there's still a lot of work to be done. I find a lot of it is kind of in that hardware enablement side, and because I think what we're seeing is this rush of new hardware architectures, or they're not necessarily new, but they're new to the data center. They might be coming from mobile phones, ARM architectures, things like that, or from gaming consoles in the form of GPUs. And now we have things like SmartNICs, and DPU is kind of the new term that's been coined out there for, I guess, data center processing unit. So all these kind of unique ways to optimize performance and energy consumption for different workloads. That stuff doesn't just magically work out of the box. And so as you talk about, abstracting away that hardware so that the applications don't have to worry about it, that is more work that needs to happen in Linux and OpenStack and presumably to some extent in Kubernetes as well, which is just kind of maybe the bias of the people I talk to. But what do you all think about kind of this proliferation of new, say just the chip side of it, including like SmartNICs and things like that? I mean, it does seem like that is a growth area, which brings new capabilities, but also new complexities Maria, you're nodding along, so maybe I'll
nodding vehemently. Yeah, these are discussions that we have all the time. Like whenever you put the stack together and you're saying, where do I put the investment in which sort of project, so that then ultimately the workloads can benefit from it? Do we do the work in OpenStack only? Do we do it in Linux? Can I get all the way down? If I put it in this configuration, if I put in this other configuration, the fact of the matter is we need to test in all of them. So we need collaboration across the board. So and we do that. And that's why our our networking team is a hybrid platform or cloud platform networking team. Is not just the OpenStack networking team or just the Kubernetes OpenShift networking team. So we look at all of those together and work closely too with the networking team at RHEL. Because those decisions impact in the stack. So we definitely see the work that needs to happen in all communities.
Yeah, and I think the tendency to reinvent the wheel sort of was kind of hinted at earlier, but it just seems to be human nature. I don't know, but the more we can not do that and sort of learn from reuse code or reuse learnings or realize that all these concepts exist at whatever we want to consider the layers, and the more things need to kind of be able to talk to each other across these sort of styles of environments, from containers to VMs and down to bare metal, like that. Just it's a big priority. I think it should be for all these different communities working together. And I guess, Phil, to ask you a similar question, in your customer base, are you seeing increase in demand for things like ARM architecture, or GPUs I think are kind of like table stakes these days. They've been quite common for different use cases for a while, but maybe it's FPGAs. Are you seeing more demand for that, or is that more like just pie in the sky hype for 5 years from now? Or are people actually wanting to run some of these different architectures in your customer base today?
So the GPU one, it's super easy. Yes, have been for a long time. It was something that I remember, a number of years ago being there. Oh, we need to get GPU pass-through working. That's done, dusted, and out of the way, right? The big thing now is around SmartNICs, the DPUs. How can we actually get the functions exposed up the stack? And I think it was Tuesday morning, I was talking reference architectures for storage clusters, and the company I was talking to were like, and if you have an ARM architecture, absolutely share it with us. It's something we're super interested in. I think the biggest challenge we have right now is actually getting hold of hardware, not just ARM, but just in general. Getting the interop underlying work done is super important right now for those new shinies.
Yeah, it's a good point. I guess we would be remiss at this day and age not to talk about supply chain problems. No, I'm kidding. But yes, getting a hold of hardware is certainly getting hold of anything these days seems like harder than it used to be. But yeah, I think that's another thing we can help with as a foundation, cross foundations with is bringing people together for test environments and things like that. There's a lot of real world work to be done and collaboration, coordination. So as we kind of wrap up here, I guess just want to ask you all for any closing thoughts on where you see the future of LOKI going. Phil, I'll just go back to you first.
Yeah, I really like the idea of adding another letter to the acronym as we start thinking about the application side of things and the abstraction. I don't know what the letter would be because LOKI doesn't sound great. But yeah, thinking about that next level of abstraction, or the next level of the infrastructure would be where my head's at.
Maria, what do you think?
Oh, that's interesting. Obviously we see this as going and going and going. Maybe the level of development or just sort of rapid change, happening at different stages and in different places, with Linux and OpenStack being just so standard now in many industries. We talked telco, but I wanted to sort of also mention banking. They're less vocal than telcos, kind of more private in general, but they do get together in sort of roundtables and talk about their infrastructures, because there's the big banks that have the the big money and effort to sort of contract this large infrastructure, and then they have their lessons learned, and then they publish the reference architecture for others to see, and then others benefit from that. So smaller banks also start using those models. So also automotive is another one, and then you absolutely know the growth to the edge. So LOKI stretches out also to the edge, where we just see different use cases being used. So as long as we keep the communities going, I think we're going to continue to see use, and we have many companies that 100% have been on this infrastructure running for a long time.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I love that. Reminder that the banking world is extremely invested in and in production, with trillions of dollars flowing through these systems that are built on these technologies. So we have a big responsibility to keep improving for that use case. Automotive is extremely common as well, and as you said, LOKI to the edge. I love that. Well, I want to thank Phil and Maria today for joining us, and just to have a few closing thoughts here on our show and what's happening next in the OpenInfra community. I want to actually thank all of the member companies who are members of the Open Infrastructure Foundation. Their support makes it possible for us to do what we do, organize the communities that write software that runs in production, including these two guests today, or from the two of these awesome companies that provide us support. And speaking of getting together and solving hard problems, testing new architectures, we are going to Berlin for the OpenInfra Summit in June. This is very, very exciting. Many of us have been missing all of you, missing each other, being able to get together in person. All these hard problems we're talking about, we can make more progress if we can get together in person. So I really hope all of you can join. We have the URL here, openinfra.dev/summit. You can find out about registering, what's happening as we're putting the schedule together. Sponsorships are still available. We've got a ton of companies that are planning to have a presence. Perhaps you would like to have your company have a presence there as well. So again, we're going to Berlin. We're going in June. It's at this amazing convention center that we just went back and toured a couple of weeks ago, and it was awesome. So we're really looking forward to that. Other things that we're looking forward to are future OpenInfra Live episodes. And so an upcoming episode we have planned is how OpenStack is used in academia. So you can go to ideas.openinfra.live to submit your ideas for talks, for shows, future shows of OpenInfra Live. And you can also go to openinfra.live to learn more about all the upcoming shows and just the back catalog as well. So we have tons of episodes from the past. And lastly, I want to just say thank you for joining us for OpenInfra Live. And we would like for everybody to be able to join any future episode. And I should also mention joining the foundation. It's free for individuals. Your company can also find out how to support the foundation's work at openinfra.dev/join. And with that, we wrap today's episode. And I just want to say, I hope that you all have a good time with OpenInfra.